Yesterday, you began applying what you know about multiplying with decimals to finding the volume of prisms. These two were your homework assignment. So I want to take apart a little bit what you see here on the paper because I've already done the work. So first of all, 7 4/10 and 4 7/10 comes from length times width. When I multiplied those two amounts, the last thing I did was count up decimal places and move the decimal, because when we have whole numbers and decimals involved, we need to move the decimal so that it makes sense. 7 times 4 is 28. 34 is a little more than 28. So that's another way you can check and see if your decimals make sense. What I've done now, though, is I've reminded you that when you multiply the length times the width, you're actually finding the area of the bottom. You're finding that first layer that you played with yesterday. How many cubes would fit on the bottom? So it's a good idea to figure out the area of the base, partly because you'll be asked to do that sometimes in math as well. That was something you were supposed to learn in 4th grade. And because it helps make sense of what's going on. Since these are all multiplied to find volume, you always do length times width times height. You could change around the order because the order that you multiply amounts does not matter. But when you're applying that multiplication to what is kind of a real world problem, it helps to make sense if you find the length times the width so that you know the area of the bottom. And then once you know the area, you multiply how many layers of 34 78/100 square centimeters you're going to have. And that's what happened in this step. Answer came out to be 205202. There were 3 digits past the decimal in the multiplication, so there need to be 3 digits past the decimal in the answer. So 2 things you always check when there are decimals involved. First of all, do I have the decimals? And second, when you are applying your multiplication to volume, the label. These were all centimeters, and since we are doing 3-dimensional, you want the flying 3. That means it's cubed. This problem I did the same way. Length times width came out with 38 54/100. You can see I had a couple of problems here. I made a mistake when I multiplied, and that made my adding wrong, but I went back and checked it, and that's how I caught it. That did, once I got it right, that did give me the area of the base. You would fit 38 54/100 square centimeters across the bottom here. Or cubes would fit across the bottom, but then you needed to take 3 layers of cubes, that number of cubes. You ended up with 115620, 1, 2, 3 places after the decimal, 1, 2, 3 places after the decimal. Your answer, though, could have looked 2 different ways. You could have looked exactly like this with a label of meters cubed, because all of these measurements are in meters. Or you could have recognized that this 0 in the thousandths place can totally be ignored, and you just write it as 115 62/100. If there are only 62/100, that means there are 0 thousandths, 0 10,000ths, 0 100,000ths, and you might have to go on forever writing those zeros. Since you didn't want to do that, or since I didn't want to do that, you can also just drop off the 0, but you cannot forget your label yet of meters cubed. Now what we need to do is switch over, and we're going to do a little bit where you are going to have to pause and resume here to check some work, because I'm bringing back a little bit of what we learned with fractions and decimals when we talked about remainders. So if we just look at this fraction, we do not know how to multiply fractions yet. Hopefully by the end of the year you all have that good and solid, but we'll need to add them and subtract them first, and it gets real complicated. So right now what we want to do is turn the fraction into a decimal, because those we know how to work with. How might that happen? Well, we've practiced, remember? we take the top number, the 1, and divide it by the 2. But Miss Yoder, I can't divide a smaller number by... Yeah, you can. You recognize that you will have to put the decimal because this goes in here 0 times, 0 whole times, but you put those zeros after the decimal, and now all of a sudden, 5 times 2 equals 10. So what decimal is the same as 1/2? We can substitute 6 and 5/10 instead of 6 and 1/2. Well, if 1/2 over here turned into 5/10, wouldn't it make sense to say this is 5 and 5/10? Conveniently, this is going to be 3 and 5/10. What about this one? 1 divided by 2 is still 5/10. 6 and 5/10. So knowing how to turn a fraction into a decimal can make your life much easier. Some fractions aren't quite as kind to be turned into decimals. If you encounter a fraction with a 3 or a 6 or a 7 on the bottom, those are very often unkind. But here we have a 5 on the bottom. It will not be 6.3. It will not be 6.35. We have to do the same math that we did, top number divided by bottom number. So we need to take 3 and divide it by 5. This will give us not 6 and 3/10, not 6 and 35/100. Since we can't do any whole times 5 to give us 3, we put the 0 in the whole number place, then we bring in 3/10, and all of a sudden it is 30 divided by 5. Oh, well, that's 6/10. So what amount do we have over here? Not 6 and 3/10, not 6 and 35/100. We have 6 whole things and 6/10. So you must do some math when turning a fraction into a decimal. You see there is no 3/5 in half. There is no 1/2 after the decimal. You have to do a bit of math to come up with the correct decimal substitute for the fraction. Now that we have turned all of these fractions into decimals, now what I want you to do, you can see enough of you can see enough of the page. I want you to do these 3 problems. Yes, I know it already gives the answer for the first one over here, but this is a good way to check me and see if indeed you take the length times the width times the height, substituting 6 and 5/10 instead of 6 1/2, do you still come up with 65 centimeters? So I want you to do these 4 problems. Pause the video. When you see the resume sign, that means I'm going to start solving them, which would be right now. So length times width, I need to take 6 and 5/10 times 5. These are much nicer numbers than you had to deal with in your homework. 5 times 5 is 5. Carry the 2. 5 times 6 is 30 plus 2 is 32. Deal with the decimal one place after it. 32 and 5/10. That means across the bottom, the area, the number of cubes you'll have in one layer is 32 and 5/10. It does not tell me here that these are centimeters, but it tells me up in the directions that these are centimeters. So right now, I just have square centimeters. I need to take the 32 and 5/10 on one layer and multiply it by the 2 layers. 2 times 5 is 0. Carry the 1. 2 times 2 plus 1 is 5. 2 times 3 is 6. One place after the decimal. Doink it. 65. Or 65.0, that's what they say over here, Now, they got this answer wrong. They said the label is only centimeters. They should have labeled it as cubic centimeters. All right. So, number 1, again, length times width. 5 and 5/10 goes on top because it has the most digits, times 5 whole things. I don't line up decimals because I'm not adding and I'm not subtracting. 5 times 5 is 5. Carry the 2. 5 times 5 is 25. Whoops, plus 2 is 27, not 12. Haha. 27. One place after the decimal. Am I done yet? Nope, because that just tells me the area on the bottom is 27 and 5/100 centimeters just on the bottom. And I am going to double check that right away before I go on, because if I got that wrong, that would be awful, wouldn't it? But I got it right. So now we are going to take that number of squares and we are going to stack them in 2 layers. So we have 27 and 5/10 2 times. The one with the most digits goes on top. Don't line up decimals because I'm not adding and I'm not subtracting. 5 times 2 is 10. 7 times 2 is 14 plus 1 is 15. 2 times 2 is 4 plus 1 is 5. One place after the decimal, one place after the decimal. This is the final answer, but to label it, it's 55 centimeters cubed. So then we move on to number 2 down here. Length times width. So we'll take the one with the most digits, 3 and 5/10, times 3. I'm not adding, I'm not subtracting, so I don't line up the decimals. 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times 3 is 9 plus 1 is 10. 3.5 times 3. Am I done yet? Nope, because there's one place after the decimal here, so there must be one place after the decimal there. Now, that tells me how many square centimeters would be on the area of the bottom. But I now need to stack them up 4 times. So I take the area times the height. 5 times 4 is 0. Carry the 2. 4 times 0 plus 2 is 2. 4 times 1 is 4. One place after the decimal, one place after the decimal. That's my final answer, but what do I write over on the line? Because I'm finding volume, this was 42 centimeters. They're not squares, they're not flat. I stacked them up, they're 3D. We would call that cubed. Number 3, length times width. 6 and 5/10 goes on top because that has the most digits. 3 times 5 is 15. Carry the 1. 6 times 3 is 18 plus 1 is 19. What do I do about that decimal? Well, I have to move it one place, which gives me 19 and 5/10, which makes sense because 6 times 3 is 18, and this is just a little bit more. That tells me what? When I take my length times my width, it tells me the area of the base is 19 and 5/10 centimeters square. When I'm talking about the flat surface on the bottom, it's always square. When I label area, it's always in squares. But now I need to take those 19 and 5/10 and stack them up 3 times. Put the most digits on top. I'm not adding, I'm not subtracting, so I don't line up the decimals. Just multiply. 5 times 3 is 15. 9 times 3 is 27. Carry the 2. 3 times 1 plus 2 is 5. One place after the decimal, I move it. Can I ignore this decimal like I ignored the other 2? No. There's actually something in there. In the 10th place. I'm not got a placeholder. I actually have 5/10 there. So my answer has to be, did I do something wrong? Oh, right here. 3 times 9 is 27. I forgot to carry the 1 from 3 times 5. So it's 58 and 5/10. Aha! 58 and 5/10 centimeters cubed or cubic centimeters. Number 4, length times width. Most digits on top when you multiply. Do not line up the decimals because you are not adding or subtracting. 24, 25, 26. One place after the decimal. So my area on the bottom is 26 4/10. If I talk just area, it's square centimeters. What do I need to do now with those squares? Oops, that you can't see it all. Sorry about that. What do I need to do with those squares? I need to take them and stack them up. How many stacks do I have? 2. So I take the 26 4/10. That's the most digits. That's why it's on the top. The 2 is on the bottom. I'm not adding. I'm not subtracting, so I don't line up my decimals. 4 times 2 is 8. 6 times 2 is 12. Remember to carry and add it. 2 times 1 plus, or 2 times 2 plus 1 is 5. One digit past the decimal. So move my decimal one place. Can't ignore the tenths place because it's more than a placeholder in there. So my answer is 52 8/10 centimeters cubed. Unfortunately for you, your homework is a bit trickier. You have 4 problems. If you came and picked up the papers, they look like this. And I'm not asking you to do surface area. That would be something totally different. If, however, you want to do just the area of the base, that would give you extra credit. If you can figure out what the area of the base is, I've mentioned it, I've shown it to you as we went through the examples. So if you want the area of the base on here, that is part of what you need to find to figure out the volume. Just be sure of a couple of things. After you do all of the math, ask yourself, do I have the decimal? And do I have the label? Remember, if you didn't catch it, go back and watch earlier in the video. The label for the area of the base, it's a different label than if you find the label for the entire volume. All of these labels are going to be meters. All of these labels would be centimeters. This will be some type of meter. This will be some type of millimeter. Make sure that you show all of your work. And remember, it is important which numbers you multiply when you are finding the area of the base. You can't just pick 2 numbers to find the area. It has to be the length times the width. That I will say really clearly here. As the last thing before I assign this, area of the base is extra credit. Volume must be correct. That part is assigned. Have fun!